China's power and resolve? How serious is it about challenging the regional order? And how hard can it push? Big subject. I'm going to be quick here. Let's start with China's power. China is the world's second biggest economy today, or biggest on one measure, as Nick said. And it's continuing to grow for an economy of that size astonishingly fast. It's slowing, of course, but it's not failing. It will, in all probability, 95% probability, overtake the United States to become the biggest economy in the world and keep growing faster than the United States after that. And that makes a big difference because wealth is power. If you doubt that, ask yourself, which was the most powerful country in the world in the 19th century and which was the richest? Britain, in case you don't know your history. Which was the most powerful country in the world in the 20th century and which was the richest? America. So there's a fairly strong correlation, just straight off the pin, between wealth and power. If China is, as I think it's very likely to be, the world's wealthiest country in the 21st century, it's very likely to be the most powerful. And even if it's not, in terms of its capacity to challenge the United States, it's worth bearing in mind that its economy today is twice as large relative to America's as the Soviet Union's ever was at the height of the Cold War. Twice as large. And the Soviet Union was powerful enough in the Cold War to give the United States a very serious run for its money. Militarily, China is not the equal of the United States in aggregate military capability, but it doesn't need to be. It has the capacity, it already has the capacity to raise the cost to the United States or the United States' own military operations in the Western Pacific far higher than they've ever been before. High enough to change America's strategic calculations. And its economic scale, which makes it the most important source of economic opportunities for every country in Asia, gives it immense diplomatic weight. You better believe that. If you don't think that economic power translates into diplomatic weight, you should drop into the cabinet room someday and listen to how they talk about it. So it's got a lot of power, and it's got a lot of resolve. China has accepted American leadership in the decades after 1972. But as my son used to say to me when he was younger, that was then, this is now. Things have changed. China is no longer a desperately poor country. It approaches the questions of its future status with a very deep sense of a remarkable history, a very deep sense of what it regards, rightly or wrongly, but that doesn't matter. What matters is what they think, as a century or two of bitter humiliation, mostly at the hands of white guys like us, with a very strong sense of achievement of the last few decades and with cautious optimism about its future. I think it would be remarkable for us to expect China not to be extremely serious about building what Xi Jinping calls a new model of great power relations. If it's not, it is unlike any rising power in history. No rising power in history has ever refrained from trying to expand substantially its leadership role in the strategic system in which it works, except post-war Japan. And I don't think it's going to follow that example. So I would say we would be very unwise not to expect that China is as willing or more willing to change the regional order as we in the United States, are to preserve it. We should not doubt the depth of China's resolve. US power and resolve, also a complex question. This is a second issue. How serious is America about preserving the rules-based order? Well, the United States is not in decline, at least in any absolute sense. Its economy is doing pretty well, actually. But relatively, it is. As China's economy grows, as other elements of Chinese power grow, the position of unchallengeable primacy which America appeared to have achieved at the end of the Cold War has been very significantly eroded. So America remains a very strong country, an immensely strong country, but it's not as strong as they thought it is, and it's not as strong as we in Australia have thought it is. And it is in denial about this. No American political leader has ever stood up and told Americans that their country is no longer going to have the world's strongest economy, for example. And militarily, it's not as omnipotent as many Americans and many of the rest of us assumed. It still has extraordinary military power, but it can't cheaply win against major regional adversaries in their own regions, against Russia in the Ukraine, or against China in the East China Sea or the South China Sea. And it too has to be extremely careful of the economic costs of confrontation. What are the costs and risks of this approach? What happens if it doesn't work? And in particular, what are the risks of confrontation? One of the differences between my analysis of this issue and most others is that I take more seriously the risk of war. And a lot of people find that odd, because they think, surely, people aren't that dumb. I mean, how could this possibly come to war? Why would that be in anyone's interest? Well, it wouldn't be, just for the record. But that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Anyone who's very confident that escalating rivalry between the US and China over who is the leader of the Asian order will not result in war must be very confident that one side or the other is going to back off. And the question you've got to ask yourself is, who are you expecting to back off? Is it America that's going to back down, or China? Either of them could, of course. But if neither of them does, then that's how wars start. That's what happened in 1914. And if we think, as the Australian government apparently does, that we're willing to fight, that's why we're building the submarines, isn't it? Then why should we assume that the Chinese aren't, if their resolve is just as strong as ours? And just to be clear, if a war does start, it's not going to be short, and we're not going to win it. I don't just mean we Australia, we the United States won't lose it. It will be very inconclusive, and it could easily escalate. So I think there's a real, that we have, when we think about this thing, the fourth factor we need to bear in mind is that there's a real risk of war, not a certainty by any means, but a real risk, and a risk we have to take very seriously. And the fifth point, of course, then, is, well, how bad would it be if China does change the order? How bad would it be if we do accommodate China and give it some space? Well, a very important part of the answer to that is we don't know. We don't really know what China wants. We don't know what they want now, and we don't know what they'd want if they found themselves with more power. So it's risky. It's very risky. And we'd have to sacrifice some things we value. We'd have to sacrifice some of the things we call values in order to accommodate China rather than resisting it. But it is worth bearing in mind that if we don't, we are setting ourselves on a path in which we're either assuming China's going to back off, or we're deciding we're willing to fight a war over it. And you do have to ask yourself, would the kind of concessions we'd have to make in order to avoid that kind of escalating rivalry be so bad that it'd be better to fight a war with China, which we can't win, to avoid it? Well, values are important, but I just remind you that peace is a value too.
What do you guys think? Is his view on China accurate? Please leave your comment below. We would love to hear from you.
Thank you for making it this far. If you like this video, you might want to share it with a like-minded friend. Thank you, and as always, stay blessed.